Friends, there's absolutely no need whatsoever to say anything about President Karzai that you all know him very well. In less than, I think, 24 hours, the most important power of the world will have a new president. I think we can do no better in opening this conversation than by discussing or actually seeking the President's views on what implications does this event have for what is clearly one of the major battlegrounds of the world. Afghanistan, the region around Afghanistan, to the west of Afghanistan, there is a spreading conflict zone. There are tensions to the east of Afghanistan, which require constant and consistent management. Certainly to say that we live in dangerous times is a complete underestimate. So, President, why don't we take out a mirror which looks into the future, right, and see what it actually tells us. Perhaps even if you take it into the framework of just this year.
Well, a mirror will make us look into ourselves. Let's turn it around and let the rest see themselves there. Thank you very much, sir. Very, very kind. And thank you, the audience. I see a good presence, a sweet presence. I'm happy to be here. Well, where should I start is the question. Speaking of President-elect Trump and his inauguration tomorrow, we congratulate him. And we wish the best for him and the American people, and of course for all of us around the world. But he is definitely taking over in a very critical time. At a time where convergence of interest is disappearing, at a time where cooperation on important issues is no longer seen as visibly as we had 15 years ago, at a time where extremism, radicalism, terrorism, all the bad things that we keep hearing and keep experiencing are on the rise, where death and destruction, unfortunately, is as if the order of the day in some of our countries and societies, from the Horn of Africa all the way to us in Afghanistan and Pakistan and beyond sometimes. I guess what you're asking me is, what would I advise President Trump to do?
No, also what you expect.
What I expect of him? What I expect of him, I would rather say I would advise him, that's my expectation, to do the right thing. And the right thing for us in Afghanistan, and by extension also the region, would be, and inevitably I have to go to the past a little bit. When in 2001, and after the tragedy of September 11, the collapse of the Twin Towers in New York, immediately we in Afghanistan recognized that this was a time for action by the United States and hopefully, and perhaps we were right as well, the salvation of Afghanistan from a creeping invasion that had taken over our country, in our dress, in our uniform. We wanted them to come, and they did. The arrival of the international community, led by the United States, and then the support of the rest of the international community, China, India, Iran, Russia, everybody, to that exercise led to the freedom of Afghanistan, to the liberation of Afghanistan, and to the flourishing of Afghanistan once again as a nation state back on the world stage. With immediate success, we managed to free ourselves in less than a month and a half. Schools reopened, society re-emerged, and our expectations were flowing like clear, running water. And of course, we are very, very grateful for much that has happened in Afghanistan in a good way. Education, our democracy, our freedom of the press, our improving health services, and that our flag is rising again around the world, and much more. But in the fundamentals of things where we helped the United States and its allies, and the rest of the help supported as well, in fight against extremism and terrorism, as we see, and I don't need to give examples, we are not doing well. I will not go as far as saying we have failed because that will be too harsh, though that is exactly my sentiment. But I would say that we need to explain ourselves as to what has gone wrong, why have we not been able to defeat extremism, why are they on the rise, and why have new groups emerged in the wider region from Libya to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and who is to blame for, who is responsible. You must have heard me, during my presidency, I was a strong critic of US military engagement in Afghanistan, the way they conducted themselves in Afghanistan. I wanted change, and I kept saying that what they're doing is causing harm to the Afghan people and also to the cause that we have. Therefore, my advice to President Trump and my expectation of President Trump would be to take a deep, deep look into the past 15 years and begin to reanalyze, go back to the drawing board on Afghanistan and the wider region, see who is an ally and who is not an ally, see why we have failed in defeating extremism, see why there is more extremism, who is responsible. Pakistan has been an ally with America and a neighbor with us. The people of Pakistan are the closest of the people to us, and we owe a great deal as Afghans to them, to their support for us. But we also see that there is an establishment in there that doesn't do what we sensibly think they should be doing. I remember during my presidency that major powers, all of them encouraged me to sign strategic partnership with the United States. India did that, Russia did that, China did that. But as I see today, that agreement isn't there anymore. There is now more discord. Russia and America don't see eye to eye anymore on many issues, including Afghanistan, where they did before. China has apprehensions. India is rebalancing, realigning its policy in a strategic way. And I would tell you, my friend Mr. Akbar, there's this lovely Indian song or poem, Babuji Dire Chalna, Pyar Mein Zara Samanda, Bade Do Ke Hi Is Raah Mein. In this realignment, you have to be careful as to what where you lead yourself and what you do. So my advice to Mr. Trump would be, look deeper. If you are really in the fight against extremism, you're not winning. We are not winning, we are suffering. And find out why have we failed, who has failed us, or have we failed ourselves, and then come back and we'll be there to help you, India, Afghanistan, and everybody else.
President, just a minor observation when you mentioned that lovely song by Geeta Dutt.
Yes.
Never forget that's an Indian song.
I remember that. I will never forget. Yes, sure.
So the message of that song is deeply ingrained in
Yes.
our attitudes.
Yes, that's why I mentioned it.
And we walk carefully.
Yes, good, good.
And one of the interesting aspects of our relationship and our engagement with the world is that we must be one of the few countries, I can't say the only country, one of the few countries which has, I think, completely comfortable relationships, friendly relationships with competing binaries.
Yes.
And to achieve that, I don't want to get into the business of mentioning the names of countries, because, but to achieve that requires working out a foreign policy that one is fundamentally anchored in creating or trying to create prosperity rather than war, that eschews conflict, both as a means as well as an end, and reflects essentially the will of the Indian people.
Exactly.
And the will of the Indian people is at this moment, and I think for ever since we became independence, is to create a very prosperous, strong, and secure nation.
Absolutely right.
And when we say that we have a defense ministry, let me tell you, the surprise is, which sometimes people don't get, when we say we have a defense ministry, we actually mean it. Our ministry is actually for defense, not for offense.
Yes, indeed.
On the other hand, we understand the meaning of defense. And therefore, not a single Indian, not a single inch of our territory is open for compromise.
Absolutely right.
But the question that really is troubling us all, I think, if you look at it from the historical perspective, and your own experience is a very valuable part of that history, is despite common sense telling us that the removal of Taliban is good for the people, education, the return of education, the return of gender rights, the return of girls to schools, the return of calm,
The return of calm, yes.
which you achieved, is good for Afghanistan. Then why did the Taliban revive? What precisely was there in that that led to the revival of Taliban? Despite the people having experienced what they did experience.
So the question is how?
Yes, and
Come,
how
the
and how
Taliban
do we
revived.
sort this out?
Yes.
Because the problem is still with us, and it is really an existential problem.
It is.
And if you extend Taliban, sorry for extending it, because if you extend Taliban to the myriad number of alliances it has, between the Taliban and the Lashkar-e-Taiba, we don't see much difference.
Right.
Or Jaish Muhammad, or any one of these, menacing and evil organizations that not only use terrorism as a principle of behavior, but are trying to create basically mini empires of fear.
Indeed.
How do we tackle this?
Well, I know I'm in conversation with you, but would you allow me to speak to the audience like that? Yeah?
It's your audience.
Well, sir, it's a very important question. It's the question that we all should be addressing and seeking to find answers for. I think I referred to it in a way in my opening remarks. In 2001, when all of you, the international community, arrived to help Afghanistan, as I mentioned, we got freed of that creeping invasion in less than a month and a half, without really any fighting, without much fighting. I remember the Taliban leaving villages and the community leaders and tribal chiefs taking over. I remember districts and provinces falling without a fight. And I remember the Afghan people coming to me in large numbers when I became the president, asking for more international troops in Afghanistan, asking for more assistance from the world in Afghanistan, expressing immense happiness. I also remember Mr. Foreign Minister, that the Taliban, a great majority of them, went back to their villages and settled down in their villages. They did not want to fight. They did not want to carry on what they were doing before September 11. And that is why those 3-4 years from 2002 to 2004-05, we had a very, very peaceful Afghanistan. It was around 2004-05, and I must say this here, that I began to have trickles of news coming to me as the president of the country, informing me of what our neighbors in Pakistan were doing in trying to attract back the Taliban and regroup them and reorganize them and prepare them. And that's where I have my greatest complaint with my allies, the Americans, our friends. Immediately we began to tell them that this is what's happening there. We gave them names, places, locations, entities, organizations that were doing that, and who and how they were contacting people inside Afghanistan. Around this time, unfortunately, in the military campaign against extremism, the United States began to actively engage its military in Afghan villages, in Afghan homes and Afghan towns. This again, we went and told the United States was wrong, in a manner of pleading. The Afghan villagers would come to me and say, President, why are they doing this? They are supposed to be our allies. And I would bring them to the palace from the villages of Afghanistan, and I would make them sit down with American generals so they would hear it from our people directly. But to no avail. They kept doing that. So civilian casualties, violation of Afghan sovereignty, keeping prisons, and the creation of parallel structures to the Afghan government, the creation of private security firms on the one hand, by our friends, by our allies, the United States, and its our other allies, and also the opportunity that this gave to the establishment in Pakistan to recruit and reorganize and send against us. A deadly combination of a sanctuary and of increasing disappointment of the Afghan people led to what we have today. The re-emergence of the Taliban as a force, and now having more territory in Afghanistan than you would ever imagine. To go to the other question, the Taliban themselves, you compared them to Jaish-e-Mohammed and the other terrorist organizations. Those Taliban who are Afghans, who are not of an ideological inclination, or who don't have an ideological foundation that inculcates extremism, violence, and all that. They are Afghans, they are from our villages. The moment you give them an opportunity, they would return and settle down peacefully in Afghanistan. Individually, all of them would agree with you. When you sit down with them and talk to them individually, all of them would agree with you. How things are wrong, how they would like to come back to their own country and live peacefully. They're not against education for women. They're not against Afghanistan having a dignified life. They're not against life. But organizationally, they are not in charge. Organizationally, they are in the grips of a very powerful, very experienced intelligence body that knows how to use and exploit movements and people.
Which is this intelligence body?
Well, this is clearly our neighbors in Pakistan, the ISI. And that's where the United States did not do with us what we were seeking from them for years. They would come to us, they would admit it, yes, this is the case, but on action, they would fall much shorter than our expectation.
Did you say that you were defeated by a particular ideology?
No.
Rather than just a collection of individuals?
No, we are not defeated by ideology. I think the ideology of democracy, of the popular will of the people, of society that is pluralistic in its look. Afghans are by nature an egalitarian people.
Yep.
Egalitarianism is a strong foundation of our life in Afghanistan, and that leads to democratic tendencies. We have all those tendencies. Millions of Afghans voted. In the first election in Afghanistan in 2004, there are a lot of Afghans here who would remember, and also I'm sure the Indian press and the other international press is here. In 2004, in Farah province, a woman who just gave birth to a child was carried to the polling station to cast her vote. The Afghan people participated in it, so democracy was embraced. So we won the ideology of democracy, the ideology of pluralism, the ideology of a life that is not led by fear or repression. One, it was circumstances that went against us, not ideology. Circumstances, bombardment, harassment of villagers, keeping prisons, interference in the affairs of Afghanistan, trying to settle the election results of Afghanistan, and outside of Afghanistan, the sanctuaries that were ready to exploit this resentment.
In the last week of December, I think maybe 28th, certainly in the international edition of New York Times, there was a very, very fascinating article, a report, based on an interview with a Norwegian. I can't pronounce his name correctly, so but he gave an interview in which he said that he led an initiative. It was in your time.
Kaide, a chunk of Kaide, yeah, he was the UN's representative. Very fine man, yes.
Yes, the Norwegian.
Yes, the Norwegian, sure, yes, I remember, yes.
And he led, and he said he brought things together, in his view at least, a certain peace process that and he said each time that peace process was sabotaged by the ISI and by the Pakistan establishment.
Yes.
Who, before any scheduled meeting, would some 3 to 6 days before that indulge in an act of violence
Yes.
against either one of the brother or the relatives or back home in Quetta to one of the Taliban members who were ready to talk.
Yes, yes.
And terrorized these people out of. Now, I think you verify that report.
Yes,
So,
I do.
Yes. So what is it about Pakistan that makes it so invested in destruction as an objective?
In destruction of Afghanistan, in destruction in Afghanistan as an objective, yes.
I would extend that to self-destruction at some point if this continues.
As it is evident now.
Yes.
Yes. Well, Mr. Akbar, you're really very smart. I know what you're trying to lead me to, but I have learned my ways. So don't expect me to tell you everything.
I'm no longer fooled by illusions of praise.
All right. Well, you see, we have Pakistan that emerges in the process of the independence of India as a separate nation, founded on an ideology, religion, in the name of Islam, a country for the Muslims. You had Afghanistan to the west of it, an old rival of Great Britain. We had fought 3 wars, and Britain took half of our territory from us, called it the Durand Line. And upon the creation of Pakistan, that territory was supposed to become part of Pakistani territory. Afghanistan did not recognize it. So Pakistan found itself between 2 countries, that it did not consider friends. We were not willing to recognize the Durand line. You had your own issues as India with it. And as the foundation of the state was based on religion, the more they used that element, the more it radicalized itself. Like a snowball. The more you turn it in snow, the bigger it becomes. Came the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where the Afghan people had a legitimate right to defend their country, where we began to migrate in millions to Pakistan and Iran, where the West became a supporter to our resistance through Pakistan, where the Americans, in their competition, rivalry with the former Soviet Union, needed to weaken communism and the Soviet Union as a consequence, where their strategic thinkers created the idea of the Green Belt or the arc of crises around the former Soviet Union, where religion was the most important tool. In Poland, it was Christianity. Towards the south, it was Islam. And this tool became a very handy tool in the hands of Pakistan as well. One, to cooperate with the West in defeat of the Soviet Union. Two, to use it to weaken Afghanistan, to take our national element, traditional element away from us, to turn us into only religious beings, not Afghan beings. Afghanistan is an old country. We have a history, we have a tradition.
Well formulated.
That. This became an instrument with the help of the West, very powerful in their hands. And of course, they continued using it. And when the Soviet Union was defeated, when they withdrew, the Americans effectively, purposefully abandoned Afghanistan to the wishes of Pakistan. And Pakistan continued this policy. Therefore, fear of India, and a narrow land strip, and the desire for a strategic depth in Afghanistan, plus the tool that they had handy with the help of America, became all the tools in their hands, and a disaster for us.
President, in the last 16 years, the time span which we are discussing, 8 years of a Republican administration, George Bush Jr., 8 years of a Democratic administration, Obama, and not any change that can be significantly recognized at being at too great a variance. There may be fewer troops or more troops, but broadly, I think the paradigm of their policy has not shifted too much. Now, we have a new kind of president in America. What do you think that he was going to do? Is he going to be any different in his engagement with this landmass of South Asia? Or do you see some more of the same? Because there are forces perhaps more powerful than the president.
Oh, so now you're trying to take me into US internal politics. And I already am in trouble with them, so. Well, there has to be a change. The US has to change its policy in Afghanistan, in the region. The US needs to change. If it wants to succeed, it must change its approach. It must recognize the spoilers. It must recognize allies. It must reevaluate the facts on the ground as not being in their favor because of what they have done and because of what they have not done. Therefore, my very clear word on this is, and I'm purposefully being very vivid and clear here because I want to convey a message, that the Afghan people today are suffering immensely because of certain aspects of a wrong policy. But that they are not against friendship with the United States. We want to be friendly with them. We want to have them in our country. But that presence must bring the fundamentals in every society that people seek: peace, dignity, and stability. We don't have that. I was not against signing the BSA, the Bilateral Security Agreement with America. I simply had conditions. And the condition was peace for Afghanistan, the return of peace for Afghanistan, or at least a real, concerted, genuine effort towards peace in Afghanistan. And we knew that if the United States wanted to have it, they had the tools, they had the means to achieve. They may not have the same means today, because there are countries that are now viewing things differently. Russia, for example, was very supportive of U.S. presence in Afghanistan. In my conversations with President Putin from 2008 to 2012, he was consistently telling me that the U.S. was doing the right thing in Afghanistan.
They offered routes to...
They did. The transportation to cargo good from NATO countries. So I would say a fundamental change in America is required. The deep state in America, I hope, will understand that things are not as they were a few years ago, that they don't have the allies that they had in Afghanistan, or in their fight against extremism, that they are now seen with suspicion, and that they must do everything they can to remove this suspicion and join hands with everybody else, in particular with Russia, China, and India, and of course also with Iran, to bring a change. And we will be willing partners in that case.
Yeah, message clearly given, but with a codicil. Can American policy in Afghanistan change without American policy changing towards Pakistan?
No.
So we are back to square one.
We should move from square one further and help Americans do the same.
And what chance do you think that we have of some success in this very strong diplomatic effort at persuasion?
I believe there is a chance. I heard a very correct statement the other day by President-elect Trump, where he said Afghanistan was a mess, and he understood the reasons. And he also said, we don't know who to blame. Do we blame the former president, or do we blame Pakistan? Now, I would not blame President Obama too much. They have their compulsions, though I have complaints, strong ones. But I believe the United States has to begin to deeply reassess its relationship with Pakistan and demand, together with other countries, I would again go to Russia, I would again go to China, and I would again go to India, to consult and realign policies in a coordinated way in the fight against extremism, and expect results from our neighbors in Pakistan. Then we would see change.
I think there is a touchstone here, which we have to address if we are going to deal with this problem, I think, effectively. I'm sure we are dealing with this problem all the time seriously. I don't think anyone in any sensible government does not recognize the seriousness of what is going. But there's a difference between being serious about it and being effective. And so we are in Washington, and the president, today elect, tomorrow elected, asks, what is your definition of a terrorist?
Right.
What do we say?
A definition of a terrorist is a person who uses violence, death, destruction for a political purpose, or a person who is hired by an agency to do the same for a political purpose.
Good. I think this, we at this dialogue have achieved clarity on a very difficult subject. So,
I'm glad you have it.
so I think we can pause for a little bit of self-congratulation.
All right. All right.
But it is. And as long as we have clarity in terms of understanding the words we use, and we do it without either confusing our interlocutors or confusing ourselves, I think we moved somewhere, because we must never forget that I think it will soon be, or it probably is, the 20th anniversary of the UN's effort to find a definition of terrorism. And for 20 years, the world has not been able to define either the nature of the enemy. And if you cannot define who the enemy is, how on earth, or sometimes in heaven, are you going to confront it and fight it? So I think this is one of the areas in which I think we can take our cooperation forward. Now, President, there is. How do you see the role of Russia in the next stage of the emerging scenario? After all, Russia has had a very long history of treating Afghanistan, let's say, as part of its sphere of influence.
A very important role, a very significant role. A cooperative Russia on affairs of this region and in friendship with America would be a tremendous asset towards stability. A Russia that fears US intentions in this region will be a disaster for this region. So here I'm not going to address Russia. Here I'm going to address America. That President Trump, I'm glad, has good relations with President Putin, and I hope that this good relation would turn into good policy products for this region and in the war against extremism. And if that happens, we will have a stable region and an effective campaign against extremism. If that doesn't happen, I'm afraid lots of people will be using extremism as a tool, one against the other. And that will be a disaster.
President, you're asking for a reversal of a conventional wisdom that has lasted in American policy since World War II, or since a little after World War II with the famous Kennan memo or note. Do you think that's going to be easy? I mean,
You mean for the US to stop using extremism?
No. I mean for this cooperation with Russia. The strategic cooperation with Russia that you feel is essential or important to ensure stability in large parts of the world, including us.
Well, as I mentioned, we had a very effective confluence of views between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and Russia on the other hand, on Afghanistan at least. And at one stage when I complained to President Putin of the methods that were hurting campaign against extremism and terrorism by the Americans, President Putin told me, look, this is 2008, 9, 10. He said, look, we have lots of differences in lots of places with the US approach to things, but on Afghanistan we see eye to eye. But look at the situation today. They don't any longer, not only in the Middle East, but also very much in Afghanistan, don't see eye to eye. Russia legitimately, I must say, legitimately has concerns about Daesh, about the Islamic State, as all of us do. As all of us do. Who is behind it? Who is funding it? Where have they sprung up from? These are questions that we have. And somebody must answer.
Is Daesh now active in Afghanistan?
They are very much active. They're killing people. They're destroying villages. They're hurting our society in a deep, hurtful way, yes.
And they're collaborating with the Taliban?
They are not collaborating with the Taliban. There are instances where the Taliban go against Daesh, and that's where some countries have begun to view the Taliban as a force against Daesh, where some years ago it was a different issue. So yes, that's a very important question, and Russia has to be taken on board by the US. The US has to explain itself in Afghanistan and in the broader region. The question of campaign against extremism has not gone well. There are more of them.
President,
Why? These must be answered.
Haven't we heard that before? That, in order to use X against Daesh, you begin to provide space to anti-democratic and anti-liberal forces. It's happened in countries which don't really need to be named.
Look, well, it's like saying that you don't take cancer medicine because it takes, your hair away. Which one is more dangerous? Is Daesh more dangerous, or the means that you employ to fight them more dangerous? If you're left alone to your own devices without a larger institutional structure, in this case, a world institutional structure, if you're left to defending it on your own, then you go to all sorts of means, and that should not happen. That's why the US and India and China and Russia, as 4 major powers of the world, must get together in a genuine fight against extremism. In other words, the United States has to explain its genuineness in this issue. That it is really desirous of defeating extremism. Unless they do that, countries don't believe them anymore. I don't.
Well, the best we can hope for is that when we have this conversation next year, you will believe that there is agreement on what would certainly be considered, and the word has been used before, 2 things. One, that this is an existential problem. Number 2, that we are in the middle of perhaps not a world war in the conventional sense, but a war in which most of the world is definitely involved in one form or the other.
Yes.
The trouble is that everyone's diagnosis for this cancer is coming from a different apothecary.
Yes.
It is coming from a different pharmaceutical company.
Yes.
It is not coming from the same medicine that we should all actually combine to create.
Yes.
And I think the reason for that is because we are still think that there is space for strategic interest that might include or might need a tactical alliance with one form of terrorism or the other. Well, the trouble with dealing with the world is that...
No, we shouldn't be led there where we are forced to use one extremist against the other extremist. It's a situation of desperation. We should get out of this desperation. And we will only get out of this desperation when we begin to see genuine cooperation between those powers that matter. That should be our pursuit. That should be our objective.
I couldn't agree more. And the one thing I can say for our Prime Minister and our present foreign policy, that we have absolute clarity on this issue. There is no good terrorist. There is no bad terrorist. Anyone who uses, as the President said, violence and not only violence, I would extend that the real weapon of the terrorist forces is not just the bomb and the bullet. The real weapon that they use is fear.
Mm-hmm.
And if fear can be inflicted upon plural societies that we have nourished on a civilizational basis with great care, with great difficulty perhaps even, but we have achieved harmonies that are productive and progressive, that in order to protect that, we need clarity. We in India do have the clarity. I'm delighted that President Karzai shares that clarity, and I think at least we are 2 nations that can hopefully find a way forward through the fog of whatever war awaits us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, sir. Very kind. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.